Welcome to Calm Historian. In the medieval world, grand castles shone with power, while beneath them, cold, wet dungeons held prisoners who counted the hours in darkness. Tonight we'll quietly explore both worlds. Please comment where you're watching from and your current local time. And if this gentle journey speaks to you, please like and subscribe. Above ground, the medieval world looked like a painting of power. Battlements reaching into the sky, banners snapping on the wind, great halls warmed by roaring hearths and full of the murmur of courtiers. But beneath those stones lay a different kingdom, a low, damp world of narrow corridors and iron-bound doors where daylight scarcely reached, and where the ruler's authority had a harder, more brutal face. The castle and its dungeon were not two separate places, so much as two halves of the same order. One displayed wealth and control, the other enforced it. Step down into that darkness and everything changes. The air grows cool and heavy, tasting faintly of mildew and old smoke. Water works its way through the mortar and marks the hours with a steady drip. Stone walls sweat, moss and mold push through the cracks. The floor swallows sound so that footsteps echo oddly, and small barred windows let in only a thin thread of weak light, never enough to pierce the gloom. In rooms this narrow, life is pared to the essentials: warmth, food, a few words, and often even those are in short supply. Prisoners were packed into cramped spaces, sleeping on straw or bare flagstone, while chains clinked in a rhythm that measured out days. Sanitation was rudimentary. Waste piled up, inviting rats and the diseases they carried. Hunger and thirst were constant companions for many, and illnesses spread quickly where bodies were stacked or left to rot. Solitude was its own punishment. Some men and women were shut away in cellars so deep the sky became a distant memory, held for months or years with little more contact than the clank of a key. Others were kept in purpose-built holes meant to wear down both body and spirit, a bleak architecture designed to humble as much as to punish. Not all who lived there were the same. A captured noble might secure lighter treatment through money or rank, while commoners, debtors, or those accused of minor crimes could get the worst of it. Some were held for ransom, some awaited judgment or interrogation, others were left to face execution. The instruments of coercion, the threat of pain, the use of isolation, the withholding of food and warmth, were woven into a legal culture that prized order and obedience over mercy. In that sense, the dungeon was not merely a place of confinement, but a blunt tool of power. It produced confessions and compliance, deterred dissent, and kept the glitter of the visible world untouched. To imagine life, there is to imagine time stretched thin, days blurring into one another under the same dim light. Hope becomes the most fragile thing a person owns. And yet, even in the gloom, human voices continued, whispered prayers in the dark, scraps of songs passed along at night, bargains struck through bars. Those faint traces of resistance and endurance remind us that dungeons were not mere backdrops to medieval life. They were active, formative spaces that shaped ideas of justice, the balance of power, and how a society remembered itself. A place where splendor and misery literally sat, one on top of the other. Beneath the glittering battlements and shouting banners of a medieval stronghold, there were places the sun never touched. Picture the slow, uneasy descent, past narrow arrow slits, through thick oak doors iron-bound with age, down stone steps worn smooth by generations of boots. The air grows cooler, the light thins to a memory, and the world above becomes a distant rumor. These were the dungeons, spaces never meant to be hospitable, carved into the heart of power, with an intention that was as deliberate as it was cruel. They were more than holding cells. They were instruments designed to be seen, to be heard in the body and felt in the mind. In those underground rooms, the architecture of authority took on a harsher, more intimate form. Subterranean chambers tucked beneath keeps or buried within curtain walls smelled of damp masonry and straw. The clank of chains and the muffled footfalls of guards provided a constant, unsettling score. Silence. There was not emptiness, but purpose, heavy as the stones themselves. To be lowered into that blackness was a physical lesson. Law and lordship were not abstract ideas, but forces that could take away light, breath, and freedom. Power was rarely private in the Middle Ages. Kings, feudal lords, and the church each shared in the same crude message. Defiance could be contained, punished, and made visible. The dungeon made that message literal. It served both as a tool of punishment and as a demonstration, proof that authority could reach beneath the surface of daily life and remove the comforts of the world above. A prisoner's isolation became a spectacle, a warning that order would be enforced not only with banners and swords, but with absence and confinement. A castle's role in this system was twofold. On one hand, it was a fortress. Walls, towers, machicolations, and battlements answered practical threats, built to hold and to withstand sieges and raids. On the other hand, it was a symbol, impossible to ignore. Its silhouette on a hill, its iron-bound gate, the whisper of sentries at the parapet, and the knowledge of a cold void below, all combined into a single, chilling truth. This is where power resides, and this is how it is enforced. The site of a castle, the stone, the banners, the hidden cellars, was meant to keep order as surely as any garrison. Stone and silence, rampart and cell, worked together. The fortress defended the realm from without. The dungeon defended the rule of law and the prerogatives of the powerful from within. To stand at the threshold of such a place was to feel both sides of medieval authority pressing inward, the practical need for security and the human desire to assert control, so that the castle, in every shadowed corridor and locked chamber, proclaimed its rule without a single raised voice. Visitors to the Medieval Torture Museum in Chicago step into rooms that explain more than implements and iron. The exhibits show how castles were built not just to defend, but to contain. Hidden chambers, thick walls and narrow openings designed to hold elaborate prisons, and the mechanical ingenuity used to restrain anyone declared an enemy of the state or of a ruler's temper. Inside those reconstructions, the day of a captive begins not with light but with sound, the damp metallic clank of iron on stone. Fetters at the ankles dictate every small movement, reminding whoever wears them that their body has been parceled out to hinge and chain. These were crude, iron hoops, sometimes linked to chains that bit into skin and shredded clothing. Rust and grit worked into wounds, so that even a tiny shift translated into a steady, dull pain. People who had once argued in market squares, tended hearths, or walked freely down lanes found themselves reduced to the rhythm of link and lock. The cells themselves multiplied the cruelty. They were small, carved from cold masonry that drank whatever warmth might have lingered. with only a narrow slit or a barred hatch admitting light, so little that faces melted into shadow, and the mind learned the room by echo and smell. Vermin ruled those cramped spaces, rats slipping from corners to scavenge, lice burrowing through matted hair, flies thudding against eyelids and lips. Damp met human waste in the air and mixed with the sour tang of unwashed bodies. The stench became a companion that settled in the throat and refused to leave the memory. Food was scarce and unreliable. Rations might be a stale crust or a bowl of watery gruel handed out at irregular hours. Such meager fare hollowed the body until bones pressed nearer the skin and muscles slackened. Hunger and cold turned sleep into a fitful thing. Men and women rested on bare stone or on tattered pallets, their nights broken by the scrape of chain, the scuttle of a rat, or the bark of a guard in the corridor. Isolation sharpened whatever thought remained, so a single remembered voice or a flash of sunlight could dominate a whole day, and without human company, despair crept in as inevitably as any manacle. Shackles and stocks were not merely practical restraints. They were instruments of humiliation. Stocks locked limbs in a posture that ached with hours. Shackles made swift movement impossible and turned rest into torment. Corporal punishments, whippings, floggings were part of the regimen. The crack of a lash, the rattle of chains, the sight of a back seamed with blood were lessons delivered either in public squares or inside the prison, meant to serve as penance for the punished and a warning to those who watched. And so the days stretched on in a slow, grinding sequence. Confinement, hunger, cold, the petty cruelties of rust and vermin, and the constant threat of chastisement. It was a life that eroded both body and spirit, where every sense registered a new indignity, and every hour lay ahead like a corridor with no visible end. The prison door sighed on its iron hinges and closed the world out. Outside, carts creaked over cobbles, a bell tolled in the square, children ran through puddles. Inside, time seemed to hang heavier. Light came in thin and gray through narrow slits. The stone floors were cold and caked with old straw. Men and women sat on benches or hunched against damp walls, not all of them the hardened offenders of tavern tales. Many had been swept up by circumstance, a thrown word that counted as dissent, a disputed debt, an accusation of heresy murmured over a kitchen hearth. The faces were as varied as the reasons that had led them here. A wooden scaffold in the market cast a long shadow across the square. The pillory, two heavy boards grooved and hinged, waited beneath the town's careful watching. It was a simple, brutal thing, a frame that would lock a person's head and hands in public view, forcing them to stand while judgment played out. The question on people's lips was as old as the laws. What crimes earn a place in those boards? The answer was visible in the narrow faces turned toward the scaffold. Everything from petty theft to blasphemy could land someone in that device. There was no ceremony to soften what came next. A clerk might read a name, a magistrate pronounce the supposed sin, and the accused would be led forward. Neighbors fixed their eyes. Some leaned in as if to catch every detail. Others kept back, as if a glance could stain them. And then there were those who crowded forward with the eager cruelty of a public convinced of its duty. The pillory served as spectacle and sermon both. A thief was taunted for the silver he'd taken, a blasphemer shamed for words that offended heaven. a dissenter punished for ideas that unsettled the comfortable order. Each body was clamped in the boards, a heavy lock turned, held for as long as shame or sentence required. What happened after the clamping was often beyond the magistrate's control. Townsfolk joined in the punishment. Their jeers and taunts rode the midday air. Some hurled rotten fruit or stones, driven by anger, by a hunger for entertainment, or by the belief that communal scorn served as correction. Others, moved by pity, slipped bread or a ribbon through the small opening, while children copied the adults' cruelty without understanding why. When the crowd's mood turned vicious, physical abuse followed. The exposure itself fed on the humiliation until the spectacle finally petered out and the scaffold was cleared. Those who remained inside the jail and watched the pillory being set often kept their silence. The sound of the crowd was a steady reminder of how little separated accusation from freedom. The wooden clamps could hold a body, but they could not press out the harder bruise left behind, the memory of humiliation, the weight of communal judgment. In that gray space between law and life, punishment became more than a sentence from a court. It was a public story, told and retold, a lesson in order enforced as much by the people gathered in the square as by any magistrate's decree. The prison smelled of damp stone and old fear, a cold that seemed to settle into the marrow and made every breath an effort. Behind those heavy doors in the medieval world, torture was not an occasional horror, but a practiced tool of authority. Men and women accused, suspected, or condemned learned quickly that the law's hands were not always gentle. In those cells, punishment was routine, its methods designed as much to intimidate as to punish. Among the many cruel devices, the wooden horse was one of the most calculated. A plain timber beam, sharpened into a knife-like ridge, was mounted so a person could be forced to straddle it. The posture alone punished, the prisoner's weight pressed down on a razor edge, Kodiak moment a fresh stab of pain. Ropes and chains bound the legs, and iron weights were hung from the ankles, pulling the body downward and turning discomfort into sustained torment. In the torchlight, the beam looked like a triangular shadow waiting to slice, so the simple geometry of wood rope and weight turned into a machine that multiplied suffering. Every breath, every slight movement, sent knives of discomfort along bone and muscle. The cruelty reached beyond the flesh. Exposed and humiliated, the condemned found dignity stripped away as endurance became a slow arithmetic of hours. The mind, raw and battered, was worn down by fear, shame, and the desperate need for relief. Around them, the dungeon continued its small, steady noises, the scrape of sandals on stone, the clink of chains, the low murmur of those who administered or watched. Those sounds were part of the method, a soundtrack to a scene designed to produce results. Names, confessions, capitulations. In that narrow space between steel and plea, the wooden horse did its work. In a system built to punish, its purpose was as much to break the will as to inflict pain. In museums like the Medieval Torture Museum in Los Angeles and a similar collection in St. Augustine, visitors encounter reconstructions that make the brutality of these punishments painfully plain. Wood and iron are set out under gallery lights, shadows falling where a wrist might have rested, and the objects themselves act as a short, sharp lesson. Punishment was not abstract. It had a shape, a sound, a weight. From those displays, it's easy to imagine what the punishment felt like inside the stone walls, not only as spectacle, but as a daily reality. Darkness itself was part of the sentence. Prisoners were shut away in rooms where day and night blurred. A high slit of light, if they were lucky, a faint drip of water beyond reach, the slow passage of hours measured only by hunger or the ache in a limb. Solitude pressed in like a thing with presence. It turned memory brittle. Blurred faces at the edges made names lose their form. Time lost its anchors and one day folded into another until the outside world seemed like a story told by someone else, distant and unreal. Chains made the abstract weight of captivity concrete. Cold iron bit into wrists and ankles, calling attention to the body in ways that ate away at dignity. Metal links whispered and clinked with every move, a relentless metronome that mapped the limits of motion. Even stillness did not free a captive. The knowledge of those bonds hummed under the skin, the heaviness when rising, the sharp catch of breath when the chains tightened, the new rawness that marked every bruise. Restraints were practical, yes, but they were also a language of power spoken in metal and leather, a daily lesson in helplessness the body could not forget. Where isolation and restraint met, religion often stepped in as another instrument of discipline. Clergy or officers stood at a threshold between corporal punishment and spiritual correction, and faith was folded into the regimen. Prisoners were made to kneel on cold stone and to speak their sins aloud, until their own voices sounded strange. Repetitive prayers and penances were imposed like tasks to be checked off, rituals performed under watchful eyes. Confession was not only a path to solace, it became a tool of control, a way to shape conduct by shaping conscience. That combination had a particular aim. By breaking the body and filling the mind with penitential routines, the system aimed to remold character as well as to punish transgression. The goal was not always cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a deliberate effort to manufacture obedience, to strip away old habits until what remained was, in theory, a reformed person. Whether it truly reformed or simply produced quieter endurance, the result was clear. People changed, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes left hollowed and resigned. In those hush-filled cells, faith and force both worked and collided. A whispered prayer could be a comfort or a coercion. A rosary recited through clenched teeth might be a lifeline or one more part of the sentence. Whatever the intent, the scene repeated itself. A small, lightless room, the weight of iron against the skin, the cadence of penitential words, and the slow, grinding work of a system that sought to bend wills by addressing body and soul alike. In the galleries today, where objects lie quiet under glass, you can almost hear that metronome of chains and prayers, a reminder that punishment was crafted as much out of silence and ritual as out of pain. Imagine a warm, crowded square at midday, market stalls shaded by canvas, the chatter of bargaining voices drifting like a steady tide, the sudden clatter of hooves as a cart turns the corner. Into that ordinary tumult walk the officers and a prisoner, chains clinking, steps measured, the figure either bowed with shame or holding their chin defiantly high. They are escorted through the crowd like a warning carried on two legs. The whole scene is deliberate, composed with the care of a ritual. Officials pick the busiest crossroads, the place where the most eyes will gather, so the lesson will be learned by the greatest number. The stocks are a crude but eloquent instrument, a rough block of timber with a frame that clamps hands and head in a fixed, humiliating embrace. It turns the body into a living signpost. You can see the hands white-knuckled through the openings, the cheeks hot with shame, the slow, terrible patience of being made to wait while the world walks past. To stand in the stocks is to become a message. Immobility made public, a human billboard spelling out what happens when rules are broken. The pillory takes that exposure a step further by forcing the face to meet the crowd. Eyes meet eyes. The punished must drink in each jeer and sneer. Posture becomes confession. There is no hiding, only the raw vulnerability of being displayed. The air around the square thickens with small, electric details. The sour tang of sweat, the dust kicked up by restless feet. An occasional hiss that mixes scorn with a kind of morbid curiosity. Everyday sounds and smells fold into the punishment, turning the scene into something both intimate and communal. Whippings and floggings are harsher theater. A raised platform, a rope, the careful, practiced arc of an instrument of pain, then the crack that snaps off stone and tile. The involuntary flinch of the body makes the crowd hush for a heartbeat. In that silence, the enforcement of law is audible. People do not watch only for the spectacle of suffering, but to witness proof that transgression yields consequence. The law, made flesh and sound for everyone to hear and see. Reactions ripple through the watching crowd. Some feel revulsion and look away. Others take a grim satisfaction, a sense of order reaffirmed. Children with the blunt honesty of youth mimic the motions in games, learning early which lines ought not be crossed. Clerks mark the moment in ink, magistrates intone the judgment, and what happens on the scaffold gets translated into a public record. The sentence written down, then written again, on living flesh. These ceremonies are not merely punitive, they are didactic. By making abstract rules visible and dramatic, they turn one person's fate into a communal memory. The spectacle transforms law into a lesson you can see and feel, a vivid, intimate demonstration of the cost of defiance. In this way, public punishment operates like a kind of social architecture, a stern facade erected to support the fragile trust people place in one another and in the institutions that govern them. When the crowd finally disperses, the image does not vanish. It lingers in the mind of every passer-by, a grim reminder in the recesses of memory of what awaits those who choose defiance over compliance. The square returns to its ordinary noises, voices, carts, the scrape of a stall, but the lesson endures, quietly shaping behavior long after the last footfalls fade. You step across the threshold of a modern museum and feel the present fold back into the past. In places like the Medieval Torture Museum in St. Augustine, the bright hum of the street gives way to dim corridors where the air cools and the light seems borrowed from candle flames. Rooms are arranged not as dry showcases, but as scenes you can walk into. Passages that narrow, stonework that leans close, shadow pooled in corners. Guides lower their voices and ask you to listen, not just to dates on a placard, but to the silence and the small human details that hide inside it. The exhibits are made to do more than inform. They are made to be lived through, briefly and safely. Straps, panels, and other tactile displays let visitors feel the constriction of bindings. Dimmed chambers mimic the crushing darkness of a cell. The sensory design, the cool, rough touch of masonry, a low echo of footsteps, the soft clink of metal, works together with careful interpretation to suggest what confinement felt like. Not only the physical limits, but the stripping away of ordinary comforts and the odd sharp presence of fear and hope. Small touches, the faint scent of dust and iron, a draught that whispers through a barred window, deepen the sense of being there without ever blurring the line between experience and exhibit. Walking from room to room, you become an attentive witness. The museum does not force a single story on you. It invites you to imagine the lives folded into those spaces and to reckon with a past that contained both deliberate cruelty and ordinary human suffering. By engaging your senses and your imagination, these immersive moments turn abstract history into something you can almost feel beneath your skin, and they leave you carrying that memory long after you step back into sunlight. Step across the threshold of the museum's blog, and you do more than read. You're led into a world where stone corridors seem to hold the echoes of lives once bound by iron and law. The posts don't simply list facts. They lift the textures of medieval justices back into the light. The creak of a jailer's keys, the sharp tang of smoke from a public pyre, the low murmur of a crowd at an execution, so that the past feels present and human again. Careful essays guide you through how justice was actually carried out. The differences between town courts and manorial courts, the ways priests, judges, and local officials each took their part, and how the machinery of law could be solemn one moment and unpredictable the next. These pieces explain not only the rules but the rituals, showing how ceremony and habit mattered as much as statute when a life was at stake. The blog walks you through the punishments people faced, with measured scholarship and an eye for detail. You encounter public humiliation, stocks and pillories, the brand burned into skin, alongside harsher physical penalties, whipping, mutilation, the scaffold. The writing explains why some crimes drew merciless cruelty, while others ended in fines or restitution, and how community outrage, social standing, or an appeal for mercy could tip the balance between leniency and severity. Imprisonment appears in many shapes. Posts describe dank dungeon cells beneath castles, cramped urban jails, the fragile world of debtors, and the separate fate of prisoners of war or political detainees. Drawing on court rolls, letters, and contemporary chronicles, the blog recreates small, human moments. The lash of cold wind through a grated window, the scrape of a wooden bowl on stone, the furtive carving of a name into a cell wall. Most affecting are the prisoner accounts collected and interpreted there. These are not romanticized tales, but careful reconstructions of fear and endurance, of pleas for pardon, of hunger and fever, and of the rare mercies that arrived by way of a visitor's hand or a shared prayer. The voices that emerge petition, remember, grieve, and hold on, giving us a clearer sense of what life inside those walls actually felt like. Taken together, the posts form a map of human experience in a harsh age. Legal practice and ritual, the instruments of punishment, the daily humiliations of captivity, and the ways communities recorded and remembered these events. The scholarship is detailed and respectful of the evidence, yet it's always attentive to the people at the center of the story. For anyone eager to delve deeper, the museum blog is a treasure trove, rich with detail, alive with the rhythms of real human stories. It invites you not only to learn, but to listen, to feel, for a little while, what it meant to stand in those older, harsher shadows.